Thanks, Matt, and everyone for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about data and predictive analytics, and I'll try to do my part here to contribute. I have a couple of disclosures which are not really relevant to this talk. I do have some intellectual property which is not really germane. I wanted to start with the idea that, and this sort of shows a picture from the past of the patient-doctor relationship that, throughout medical history, the concepts I think are the same. We're trying to get a diagnosis when we talk to a patient or a patient's family. And as physicians or surgeons, we're trying to understand the prognosis and predict, what we might do for a patient and how it might turn out, kind of as Jacob was talking about. And if we think about our challenges today, there's some unique challenges, I think, in spine that we all deal with. We deal with access. We deal with, seeing a lot of patients and trying to select the patients that we think are the right patients for surgery. At least in our shop here, about 10% of the patients that we see in our surgery clinic end up being surgical cases. So there's a lot of inefficiency in that. How do you select patients when you do it? The costs of our implants and technologies are also challenges. And as Jacob highlighted, we want to reduce failures, we want to reduce reoperations. And so imagining a future where we could try to improve the way we do things with artificial intelligence and technology is kind of what people are interested in doing now. So I'm going to talk and start with the example of cervical myelopathy and randomized controlled trial to say that this is kind of probably the past of how we generated information to better understand what outcomes might look like in our patients, and then move forward to think about how registries and digital medical data will help us, take a more advanced perspective on predicting outcomes and selecting optimal surgery. So just case study here. 55-year-old, dean of a law school in Boston, active tennis player, has some tingling in his hand, recent falls on the tennis court, went to see a dentist and had zingers in his arms, and saw a neurologist who found pathological hyperreflexia and got an MRI, which shows stenosis of the C4, C5, and C5, C6 level. You can't see that particularly well, but pretty tight at the C5, C6 level, and naturally got a lot of opinions, which ran the gamut from laminoplasty to a front back fusion. And, he had a 2-level ACDNF, which I think most would agree is a pretty common, reasonable operation. But the question, still remained with all of that variation in care, what's the best operation? How does anybody know? Does it matter? And what about cost? And so that was sort of the genesis or the basis for doing a trial on this. And the traditional way of doing trials is you sort of think about, who is your patient population, who are you trying to study? How homogeneous a population do you need to have to make some generalizable comments and to understand things in a way that would help practitioners. And then you got to know what you're measuring and what's important to you, and things like patient-reported outcomes, and looking from an employer perspective, productivity and return to work, and from a hospital payers perspective, costs are certainly important. And so you define those study aims, and we do a trial where we compare front and back surgery, and we see that in a randomized trial, there's no difference between ventral and dorsal surgery. But when you look at this from a more granular perspective, you see that those cases treated with laminoplasty, which you see in gray, very few of those patients got worse. And a lot of those patients had significantly greater increases in their health-related quality of life. And so when we broke that out into looking at laminoplasty versus patients with anterior fusion and posterior fusion, we saw that over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years, those patients who were treated with laminoplasty had superior health-related quality of life outcomes. And the reason that I put this forward, they had fewer complications, they had less utilization of physical therapy, opioids, and diagnostic testing, is that at the end of the day, the operation that had better outcomes had lower costs. And then that begs the issue is that if you do a trial like this, which is, rigorous and well designed, you can, I think, understand the effectiveness of an operation that we use less of, namely laminoplasty. And we got good quality information, but when you're seeing an individual patient in the office, that's where a lot of these randomized controlled trials really suffer because these are population comparisons. And so, from a public health perspective, I think you can look at this kind of trial and say, we should be doing more laminoplasty in the United States than we currently do. And I think that's a fair conclusion from the study. But when you're sitting with your individual patient in the office, it doesn't help you as much. So I want to look now at registries, which was one of the topics. And you see that, if you look at the cardiology people, they are producing data on registries that, are 75,000 or more patients. Just to give you an example, here in the New England Journal, looking at differences in complications, which are very, very small. But when you're looking at common operations, you can make some, conclusions that are relevant to society. The biggest registry that we have in the spine world is the American Spine Registry. And I've been involved in that to a significant degree. A lot of cases, 500,000 cases, but there's some limitations in where we stand right now. There's no imaging data in the American Spine Registry, and most of us, I think, as spine surgeons, agree that without imaging information, it's hard to really understand what you're looking at. And if you're going, by ICD codes and by the way in which data is stored in the electronic health record, it's not as useful. The other issue with the American Spine Registry, which is an issue with really all registries that collect patient-reported outcomes, is it's hard to get patients to do it after 3 or 6 months. And the types of information that we need ultimately from these registries is to get long-term outcome data. So one thing that the American Spine Registry has allowed us to do is to get centers that have high follow-up rates. And this is the QOD spondylolisthesis project, which took the electronic health record, the patient-reported outcomes data, 12 high-volume sites, and where there was 80% follow-up. And here you have 608 patients, which is certainly nothing compared to the 500,000 patients that are in the entire registry, but you have more data than you have in a number of, randomized control studies, for example, or other, single site data sets, and you can draw some conclusions based on that. And so I just show you some examples of the types of predictive analytics research that has been generated from this kind of registry information. Decompression and fusion found to be superior to decompression alone, so it confirms the results of one of the randomized controlled trials on the topic. It was able to look at some of the things that you can't really get randomized studies easily done on. For example, comparing MIS and open technologies, defining predictors of optimal outcome, as Jacob went over from a number of studies that are out in the literature using fairly non-granular things like, BMI and previous surgery and depression and so forth. But we're getting better as the data sets become more granular at defining what predictors of return to work look like, looking at the effect of gender, obesity, and other factors on outcomes. So I think there's some very positive things that are coming out of that. But with the caveat that it is a real problem to get long-term patient-reported outcome data, and we're going to have to overcome that if we're going to make real use of these large data sets that collect patient-reported outcomes. So one of the things we did with the Cervical Spine Research Society is we developed a registry which would collect patient-reported outcomes, and we figured there's a lot of cases done per year, 160,000 cases done a year, but we wanted to systematically collect the preoperative and the postoperative imaging data on these cases to look at the safety of implants, to look at the radiographic appearance of these patients after surgery, and to just get a better understanding of this. So I show you just a couple of screenshots for how the CSRS registry works. It collects the patient-reported the clinical history from the electronic health record, uploads the radiographic images, and uploads the instrumentation data as well as gets the electronic submissions of patient-reported outcome done automatically. And one of the things that helps support this registry effort is that there's a broad recognition that we need to have post-marketing surveillance data, or I should say industry needs post-marketing surveillance data in order to provide information to the European Union as well as to the FDA. And those elements are easy to obtain in these registries, as well as the post-operative imaging, which has been valuable for a number of the instrumentation companies that help support this registry. So this, I think, is a step forward in automating some of the processes so that the patients get their patient-reported outcome data through the electronic health record automatically, are reminded automatically to submit their outcomes data, and that's improved our rate of follow-up in the collection of data, as well as the radiographic images, which allows us to really dig deeper into what the pathology is that we're studying and what the outcomes are of what we're studying. So I think there's a lot more to come. We've talked about predictive analytics using registries. We've seen many papers about how to use predictive analytics to predict who's going to have complications and not, and who'll have better outcomes or not. I think one interesting thing for the future is to use these types of data sets to really understand, are there providers or groups of providers or particular hospitals that are doing better than others. And I think that and that's going to be an interesting area to look at. I wanted to close though with getting back to Mitch's talk on AI about where we can start to apply some of these machine learning concepts to the data that we generate from these registry efforts. And I'll just show you an example. This is a problem that's been, of interest to me, lumbar spondylolisthesis. Again, variation in care in the United States, as the American Spine Registry shows, and virtually every payer registry shows, we do about 80% of these cases with fusion in the United States. We spend about $5 billion a year doing it. If you look at Europe, they do much less of this. And if we applied the way that they practice here, there would be billions of dollars of cost savings. So it's a big interest topic, and there've been a number of randomized studies on the topic, with the limitations that we see from randomized control studies in the cervical spine as well. These end up being population studies. But even though these RCTs have had differing conclusions, there are some things that emerge that are common threads. And I wanted to highlight that the SLIP study and the Nordstrom study both showed greater reoperations, both showed greater failures in patients who are treated with decompression alone. And so the challenge for us is, when we're seeing a patient in the office, is there a way we can predict, if we were to do a laminectomy, who would remain stable after 5 years, who would remain stable after 10 years. And that then, I think, now is really focusing on individual patient and individual factors about that patient that we can use to select the right operation for them. So how do we think about this? We're thinking about classifying patients as either stable or unstable, understanding that we've got patients that come in all shapes and sizes, different degrees or different types of bone health, different types of curvatures that are distinct and separate from the grade 1 spondylolisthesis that we're looking at. And so are there ways that we can leverage the data and classify patients as stable or unstable up front? The idea being that if somebody's stable up front with a grade 1 spondy, they might be more likely to do well with a decompression alone. So we've set up this registry called SLIP2, which, like the cervical spine registry, collects imaging data, patient-reported outcomes data, ODI, EQ5D, as well as costs. And I'll just show you here in a nutshell. One of the things about this registry effort is that because the data is digitally available, we send it to a panel of experts, so that a panel of experts can look at this case and they can try to give their opinion. Is this case stable? or unstable based on looking at flexion extension radiographs, MRI images, axial images, the patient's history, as well as the relevant clinical information about bone health that's available. And what we've learned and published earlier this year is that when you have a group of experts, all of whom are spine surgeons with experience, and 80% of them look at a case and say that's unstable, that patient does better with a fusion if that's what's recommended. And in a similar way, do better if a decompression is recommended with an 80% recommendation. So that's kind of proof of concept that there's a crowd wisdom that's useful in spine surgery. But where it gets interesting is we're working with collaborators at Georgia Tech and at Google's DeepMind to say, as spine surgeons, when we look at radiographs, when we look at MRIs and so forth, um, we're essentially detecting a pattern, but we can't necessarily articulate that, at least at the individual surgeon level. And is there a way that we can understand what groups of experts think to try to advance our understanding of grade 1 spondylolisthesis or other spinal diseases for that matter? So I wanted to just close with that as a future way of thinking about how we might leverage technology as well as crowd wisdom to advance AI. I think that using clinical registries that are designed to collect higher quality data is going to be an important way in which we might do that. And so just to close, sometimes as a surgeon, you feel kind of alone in this world where payers and hospitals and so forth are telling us what we can and cannot do and so forth. But I think that if we think about how we as spine surgeons can really develop the registries and develop these kind of AI algorithms to understand the diseases that we treat, we'll be in more control and we'll be able to advance care a little better than we can today. So thanks again for having me as part of this great panel.